Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. This is from Ninja Theory, who you might know from such games as
Disney Infinity's combat system.
and Brian Chase, such games as
DMC Devil May Cry.
and Ben Reeves, such games
Heavenly
as
Sword.
and Enslaved,
There you
Odyssey
go.
of the West.
You know them all.
This is their new game. It's an interesting game to talk about because of the game's development. Back in 2014, they started this project where they wanted to self-publish something smaller, something funkier. Is that the broad umbrella we're working with here?
Something that, under the constraints of traditional developer-publisher model, would not be considered economically viable.
Because, as Tamim, the creative director for the game, phrases it, we want to make games that aren't for everyone. This is for a certain audience. Who do you think that audience is for, Reeves?
That's an interesting question. I think it's for people who like experiences. It seems like it's very story focused.
Yes.
Which is, I got an even stronger handle on once I played it. Like, because I think DMC and Heavenly Sword, like, as action games and action focused.
Right.
This is less action focused than those. Even though they started off saying this is Heavenly Sword's spiritual successor, it's not going to be what you expect going in if that's all you think about.
100%. That was the big takeaway when I went to the studio as well. I think I went there with you. But I was very much, because this game, it had the vibe, or at least from the outside impression, I had the concept that people were looking forward to it because it would take advantage of Ninja Theory's specialty, which people see as stylish action and combat. And so it's not a Kickstarter game, but it had kind of like a Kickstarter like community vibe. Like, this is the champion of stylish action games coming. And then seeing the game, it's like, oh no, it's not that.
Yeah.
Really.
We did get hands-on with the combat, and I think the combat's good. Like, it's solid. It feels right. There's just not a lot of variety to the action. Let's say there's not a like long string of combos or anything.
There's no combos. There's no skill trees, different weapons. Like, it's very streamlined.
You don't power up as you go.
Right.
And that was all intentional. According to Meme, he says, I grew up playing arcade games, and I like that sort of idea of you learn as you play the game. There's not a lot of tutorial to it.
Right. And even in video interviews, he talks about, like, originally they were more combat focused, and then they just grew more confident throughout the development of, like, let's focus on just making a bold experience overall and rely a little bit more on, I want to say storytelling, but it's not as easy as like, oh, there's a lot of cutscenes in this game. It is experiential.
Right.
I think is the best vibe.
Yeah. And there's things we saw that I'm like, all right, this could be really cool. Like, there was a sequence where it's all played almost entirely in the dark, so you can't really see anything. And we haven't really gone into the story yet, but Senua is a person who's struggling with psychosis, and they actually went and studied up on that and met with a professor at Cambridge to talk about that. And so it's like that sequence where it's all completely dark. She kind of went blind, right? She had a mental blindness is what they called it. So it's like daylight in the world. She just can't see anything. And I'm like, that's a really cool way to approach a level in a game.
Right.
So you're constantly walking through this like dark area. You can vaguely make out shapes, and it's the things that are making sounds are the things you can avoid. So you hear monsters, you hear sort of enemies around you. You just can't see them, and so you're trying to avoid them based on the sound.
Yeah, and so the idea of Senua's psychosis, it is all-powerful. It's a bizarre vibe when you see an extended portion of this game. And this is a weird comparison, but it kind of... Did you guys play Thumper, Cork? I know you did.
Yes.
I know gameplay, zero correlation, but just like that overwhelming intensity vibe that Thumper would sometimes give you. I sometimes felt that way watching a lot of Hellblade, where it's aggressive. There's swirling voices around you at all times. It can feel overwhelming. It can feel really intense. It just has this swirling intensity to the entire experience. Cork, what did you think about like how much they were pushing the fact that she's hearing voices?
It seems like, kind of pulling back a little bit, the mental illness aspect of it, it seems like they're handling it a lot more maturely than like games have in the past.
It's not Eternal Darkness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's keeping things to like the spectrum of reality. So they consulted with Wellcome Trust, which is kind of a organization in England that deals with people who are dealing with mental illness, and they brought people in to like look at the game during various states of development to kind of put some of their like auditory and visual hallucinations to find ways to incorporate them into the game. And so they could say like, oh, this is not what it's like at all. Actually, it does, like these voices, this is not how they are manifested. And other times it would be like, oh yeah, the way that you've done this weird visual hallucination where the colors are super saturated. This is exactly how sometimes it is. So I think it's a very interesting way of approaching it. I think one of the most interesting things about the trip was just seeing how the team is pretty small and they're very nimble in the way that like things are very flexible in terms of where the game is, and they're playing with like what you might consider larger concepts. Like when we were playing with the combat, there are times where you kind of get you could do like a charge attack, and you can see they're still trying to figure out how to represent things visually. So they're kind of like, this is not exactly a placeholder, but they're like there's no UI, for instance.
Yeah.
So finding ways to kind of incorporate visual cues is something they're still like experimenting with.
For like bosses' health and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like they were at one point, they've got a bunch of developer diaries you can see where they were experimenting with like visual cuts and bruises on the enemies, and they're like they've moved away from that. There's kind of a neat thing where they incorporate her mental illness in the gameplay itself. Like she'll hear some of the voices will say, behind you, to indicate that an enemy, rather than just having like an arrow or something on screen showing that someone that is unseen is going to attack you. She'll have that kind of a cue too. So they're doing a lot of clever ways of incorporating it.
Yeah. One thing I think that I noticed a little bit too, and I think it'll be even more striking in the final game, is the camera's all one single cut. It's one single. It's like with Senua the whole time, like behind her, and I don't think that's entirely new. Like they didn't invent that, but just the way they're using it, and the way, especially for a game like this that has a fair amount of story to it, to have one camera that's just on her the whole time, panning around, even through loading screens, is pretty cool. And I think adds a little extra sense of like intimacy to the moment, where you kind of feel like you're there on that journey with her, which is what they're going for.
Yeah, and on the storytelling front, I mean, it's impressive how bold they're being, and to me, the creative director was big on emphasizing that like we don't want to necessarily hold players' hands through like, hey, step 1, step 2, step 3. It is going to be a little bit of a nebulous story, and just they have faith that players are sophisticated enough these days to be able to piece stuff together. They compared the tone a lot to The Revenant, the DiCaprio film, as far as the intensity. That seems to be a big focus. Also, one of the interesting little side note, if you're really in Ninja Theory's history, you know that like with Enslaved, they worked with Alex Garland, who helped me out. He worked a lot with Danny Boyle, right? So he wrote 28 Days Later and
Sunshine.
Sunshine. Thank you.
His big thing recently was Ex Machina.
Right. So he went off and made that film Ex Machina, and that was part of an inspiration for Ninja Theory, seeing that like, oh, he went off and did his own thing. Let's do our own thing in the games industry. Let's just make something bold and different and cheaper overall, so that we can be more experimental. And so the big takeaway was, some could call it artsy fartsy, but they are going for a bold experience.
And it's nice because I'll just cut you off here, Ben.
Yeah.
One thing I like about it is it does seem to have a strong creative vision. It doesn't seem, whether or not you like that.
Yes.
I think it's almost like True Detective versus a lot of other television programs. The first season. Well, even the second season. It could be either way. It had a strong voice, and that could either attract you or repel you.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel like it's being kind of focus tested to death, or it's something where it's like we've done a lot of market research, and we figure that this, as he, talking to Tamim was saying, working with publishers, oftentimes it will be a series of like, you need to have this, you can't have that. If you want to have this, you also have to add that.
Yeah.
So there isn't like a multiplayer component or leaderboards or any of that other stuff thrown in there. It is like, this is the story we're telling. It isn't going to be 40 hours long. And it isn't going to have these elements and this elements. Like they're focusing on what they want to do, and they're doing it, which I think is pretty cool.
One thing I like, because he said at one point in the game you like lose your sword, and so it's like for a couple hours there's not going to be any combat, and I'm like, that's kind of a bold choice for an action game.
Yeah,
and I like that, and I like you said, it's a strong artistic vision. They know it's not going to be for everybody, and it will probably turn some people off, but for some people it will be really, I think, a powerful experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like on the trip, I kept thinking in my mind that, like, publishing your own game, it's kind of like working from home. It has some pros and cons, but it seemed like they were very eager for feedback. Like they were watching intently when Reeves was playing for an extended period of time, trying to figure out, like, are these puzzles working out? What works? What doesn't? What maybe repeats too much? What doesn't? And a big part of the game that we saw, at least, was puzzle-ish,
Mhm.
where you're like seeing, because a big part of Psychosis is like seeing shapes and patterns and things, as they describe it. And so a big part of the game is seeing these runes, these Norse runes, and then trying to find those in the environment. A little bit, I don't know, some of the stranger parts of The Witness, or what would you compare it to, Reeves?
Yeah, Witness is an interesting comparison. I will say the one thing that I found striking is like tree branches, right? There's one area that we didn't see this in the game, but they've definitely shown it in some of their videos where like the tree branches will line up and you'll see a face in the branches.
Unclear if that's even still in the game.
Yeah, that's a good point. But that's an example of like you're lining up things in the environment. You're finding the position in the environment where those things line up and create an image.
And from what we played, that was more of the game than I expected, was walking around trying to find those.
An extended demo, and I think that is really cool a couple of times, and then it kind of keeps happening maybe a few more times than it needs to. So I think they're still polishing that up, and hopefully they'll kind of trim up and find the gem in that idea without kind of overstaying their welcome.
Yeah, I think so. And they are real perfectionists over there, if you couldn't tell from their previous work, but like especially visually, they are going through this game with a fine-tooth comb, and it does look really impressive for a game. We don't know the exact budget, but as they pitch it, it's cheaper overall than AAA. But the entire concept of this game, as they see it, is they want it to be indie, but still AAA at the same time. Want it to look good, want it to play well, but still come from an indie, bold, strange vibe.
Well, I think one example of that is they knew their budget was tight, and so they're like, we can model one character super well, and so that's Senua, who's like the main character. And they're like, we're probably not going to add any other characters in the game for her to like talk back and forth to, right? But then they did sort of like some testing on some video shoots, and they incorporated their kind of flashbacks there where she remembers like her talking to somebody else in her life.
Right, there's someone named Druth, and it's actually just live action video, but they filter it so much that even myself, being a video producer, it's like, is that?
Yeah, well, there was a point you asked.
Yeah.
It was like, because you're not quite sure. Like, that's how good the filters are, is like, it actually looks like it belongs in the game because of the video filters, but you're like, is this a real digital person or is this a video?
What am I looking at?
And they're
here?
still polishing it up, so they think they can perfect it to the point where people won't even notice.
Yeah. Cork, any other takeaways?
No, it looked really interesting. It was kind of a lot different from what I was expecting. I was expecting stylish action to some degree, running around with a sword, upgrading and getting large combos and everything. This seems like a more solemn tale about a woman kind of seeking redemption,
vengeance.
Yeah.
Fighting against a bunch of Vikings.
Do we want to set up the story? Like what happens basically? Leave it a mystery, man.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's going to be running throughout our month of coverage. So gameformer.com/Hellblade. We are going to be posting features throughout the month. Are there any of you guys are super excited about?
We just had one went up yesterday. Was the 158?
We asked 158 questions to the creative director about all of Ninja Theory. There's a lot of DMC questions in there. Enslaved, we poked fun of maybe too much, even though we all love Enslaved.
I like Enslaved. I feel bad about it.
Heavenly Sword. So
it's a goofy ending.
It's always fun to focus on a studio like that. Like Ninja Theory, I guess I've thought about them and liked their work for a while, but then you're sitting in a hotel room. All right, come up with as many questions as you can about this studio. It's fun to take that deep dive.
Another one that I like that's coming up is we do a deep dive on their mocap studio, because they built their own mocap studio. We kind of like give a tour of that and then show how their mocap sessions are quickly translated into the game, because it's almost one-to-one live action sequences, and hopefully that comes together. We tried to do some improv. It's not the best improv ever, but hopefully it gives a good sense of what the game's like.
Yeah, Reeves is in the suit, not in the game, but just to like show off the tech and whatnot. And so I haven't edited it yet, but if it cuts together as well as I think it will, I think that'll be a super fun, bizarre
solid
video.
7.
A solid 7, as some would say. That video in particular. And then also there's going to be new gameplay and stuff, but yeah.
The interesting thing about this game is that most of the time when I read our cover story or like I hear these discussions on the podcast, I'm immediately like, oh, this game is for me or this game's not for me. I am trying to figure out if I'm going to be into this game when it comes out.
What do you think about slowly walking around an environment, lining up runes, and then some sword combat and just overall intensity and having a bold flavor?
Is there a game like this?
This is Hellblade.
What would you call something like that?
It sounds good, yeah. I just don't know if I'm gonna like the gameplay.
Well, what are you hoping for and what are you not hoping for?
I want some good, I want good combat sequences. I want a great story. I want like some really cool visual effects like we've seen in some of their past games. Like I just think that if all of these elements that like they seem to be striving for come together, it'll be a really cool game and something that's a little bit different from what they've done in the past.
I can guarantee different, and I can guarantee intense.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's an interesting project for sure, and it's a fascinating experiment from the studio.
They didn't call it a horror game, but it has more like horror tendencies than I guess I expected from this game.
Sure.
Even though it's called Hellblade, like it's more like you're saying intense. But there's sequences like this could be straight up in a horror game.
Effed up is a good way of describing a lot of stuff. Yeah. So GameInformer.com/Hellblade. There we go. Thank you so much for watching this excerpt from the Game Informer Show podcast. You can click right here if you want to subscribe and listen to the audio version of the full show. Full episodes air every Thursday, and they feature Game Informer editors sitting around talking about the biggest reviews, previews. We talk about exclusive impressions of Game Informer's cover stories. We have long-form developer interviews. Everything that's great in gaming. So every Thursday, be sure to check it out.